The fog hung heavy over the Tennessee River on that cold November morning, shrouding the imposing peaks of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge in an ethereal mist. Below, in the valley that cradled the strategic railroad hub of Chattanooga, thousands of Union soldiers stirred in their camps, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The gateway to the Deep South, as Chattanooga was known, had fallen into Union hands in September, but now the men in blue found themselves in a precarious position, surrounded, besieged, and starving. Major General Ulysses S. Grant stood at the edge of the Union encampment, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he surveyed the Confederate positions looming above. 2 months earlier, the Union Army of the Cumberland had been routed at the Battle of Chickamauga, retreating in disarray to Chattanooga. The Confederates, led by General Braxton Bragg, had followed, establishing an imposing siege line that stretched from Lookout Mountain in the west, across Missionary Ridge to the east, effectively trapping the Union forces and cutting off their supply lines. "They've got us in a death grip," muttered Major General George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, whose stalwart defense had prevented total disaster at the previous battle. Grant nodded grimly. "For now," he replied. This account draws from dispatches published in Harper's Weekly from December 1863, detailing the dire situation of Union forces prior to the battle. The situation had grown desperate by late October. Union soldiers were reduced to quarter rations, horses and mules were dying by the hundreds, and ammunition was dangerously low. President Abraham Lincoln, recognizing the strategic importance of Chattanooga, had responded by appointing Grant to command all Union armies in the Western Theater and rushing reinforcements from the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Potomac. By late October, Grant had implemented his plan to break the siege. In a daring nighttime operation on October 27th, Union forces had opened what became known as the Cracker Line, a new supply route that bypassed Confederate positions. Provisions and ammunition began flowing into Chattanooga, revitalizing the beleaguered Union Army. As November wore on, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic battles of the Civil War. Grant's plan was characteristically bold, a series of coordinated attacks against seemingly impregnable Confederate positions. The Union forces now numbered around 60,000, while Bragg commanded approximately 45,000 troops, but the Confederates held the high ground, a tremendous defensive advantage. On the night of November 22nd, Grant summoned his commanders to his headquarters, a modest wooden structure near the river. Present were Thomas, commanding the Army of the Cumberland, Major General William T. Sherman, who had brought elements of the Army of the Tennessee, and Major General Joseph Hooker, who had arrived with reinforcements from the Army of the Potomac. "Gentlemen," Grant said, tracing his finger along a map spread on the rough wooden table, "tomorrow we begin. Sherman will cross the river and attack Bragg's right flank at the northern end of Missionary Ridge. Hooker will demonstrate against Lookout Mountain to prevent reinforcements from reaching Sherman's point of attack. Thomas will hold the center, ready to exploit any weakness." The generals nodded in understanding. Each knew that failure meant the potential loss of Tennessee and a crippling blow to Union morale. Success would secure Chattanooga as a Union stronghold and create a launching pad for the invasion of Georgia. As darkness fell on November 23, 1863, thousands of men on both sides tried to sleep, knowing that dawn would bring the thunder of guns and the beginning of what would become known as one of the most spectacular Union victories of the Civil War, the Battle of Chattanooga. Dawn broke cold and clear on November 23rd. The mist that had blanketed the valley in previous days had lifted, revealing the full grandeur and menace of the Confederate positions. From their elevated vantage points, Southern gunners had a perfect view of Union movements in the valley below. The soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland, still smarting from their defeat at Chickamauga, stirred nervously in their trenches, awaiting orders. Grant's plan for the day was modest: a reconnaissance in force toward Orchard Knob, a small hill about a mile in front of Missionary Ridge. The movement was intended primarily to determine Confederate strength and to prevent Bragg from detaching troops to reinforce Knoxville, where another Union force was threatened. What transpired, however, would exceed all expectations. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 25,000 men of Thomas's Army of the Cumberland formed into line of battle before their entrenchments. The sight was magnificent and terrible, a long blue line stretching for over a mile, bayonets gleaming in the autumn sunlight. According to the New York Tribune's field correspondent, never was a more majestic sight witnessed than when these veteran soldiers moved forward in perfect alignment, their banners catching the sunlight as they advanced toward the enemy positions. A single cannon shot signaled the advance. With parade ground precision, the Union troops marched forward across the open plain toward Orchard Knob, where Confederate pickets watched in growing alarm. The rebel skirmishers fired a few scattered shots before retreating. Behind them, the main Confederate line on Orchard Knob prepared to receive the attack. Brigadier General Philip Sheridan, leading his division forward, turned to his staff and remarked, "Gentlemen, this is not a mere demonstration. We're going to take that position." As the Union forces approached Orchard Knob, Confederate artillery opened fire, sending shells screaming into the advancing blue lines. Men fell, but the lines closed and continued forward. When they came within range, Confederate infantry unleashed a volley that caused the Union line to waver momentarily. General Thomas, observing from Fort Wood, held his breath. Would his men, so recently defeated at Chickamauga, stand firm under fire? His concerns proved unfounded. With a tremendous cheer, the Union soldiers surged forward, sweeping up the slopes of Orchard Knob. The Confederate defenders, outnumbered and unprepared for the ferocity of the assault, fell back in disorder. Within minutes, Orchard Knob was in Union hands. General Gordon Granger, commanding the 4th Corps, personally planted the Union colors on the summit. "By God, gentlemen," he exclaimed to his staff, "this was intended as a demonstration, but Thomas's boys have turned it into a battle." Word of the success quickly reached Grant at his headquarters. The normally impassive commanding general permitted himself a small smile. What had been planned as a limited reconnaissance had yielded significant results. Orchard Knob would now serve as an advanced command post with excellent views of the battlefield, and the swift victory had boosted the morale of the Army of the Cumberland. Braxton Bragg, observing the loss of Orchard Knob from his headquarters on Missionary Ridge, was furious. He summoned his corps commanders for an emergency council of war. "This is but the opening move," Lieutenant General William Hardee warned. "Grant is too clever to show his hand so early." Bragg nodded grimly. "Strengthen the positions on Lookout, Mountain, and Missionary Ridge. We shall teach these Yankees what it means to attack entrenched positions on high ground." As night fell on November 23rd, both sides prepared for what was to come. The Union success had been modest but important, a symbolic victory that restored confidence to the recently defeated Army of the Cumberland. More significantly, it had secured a valuable position from which Grant could better observe and direct the coming battle. In the Union camps, soldiers slept fitfully, aware that the next day would bring even fiercer fighting. Few could have predicted the spectacle that would unfold on Lookout Mountain, a battle that would literally rise above the clouds and enter into American military legend. November 24th dawned gray and misty. Dense fog shrouded Lookout Mountain, its peak completely obscured from view. The towering mountain, rising nearly 2,000 feet above the Tennessee River, seemed an impregnable fortress. Confederate troops had established strong positions along its slopes, with artillery emplacements commanding the valleys below. To many in the Union Army, the idea of assaulting such a position seemed like madness, but Major General Joseph Hooker had other ideas. Recently arrived from the Eastern Theater with elements of the 11th and 12th Corps, Hooker was eager to restore his reputation after his defeat at Chancellorsville. When Grant ordered him to make a demonstration against Lookout Mountain to divert Confederate attention from Sherman's main attack, Hooker decided to push beyond a mere demonstration. "If opportunity presents itself," he told his division commanders, "we shall attempt to take the mountain." At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Hooker's forces began their advance. Brigadier General John W. Geary's division crossed Lookout Creek and began moving along the western slopes of the mountain, while other divisions prepared to advance directly against the northern face. The plan was to sweep around the mountain, rolling up the Confederate flank and rear. The Cincinnati Gazette reported, "What followed would become one of the most dramatic engagements of the entire war, a battle fought so high on the mountain, that observers in the valley could see only flashes of gunfire through breaks in the fog. It truly was a battle above the clouds. The Confederate forces on Lookout Mountain, commanded by Major General Carter L. Stevenson, were spread thin. Bragg, believing the position too strong to be seriously threatened, had weakened it by transferring troops to his right flank to counter Sherman's expected attack. When Hooker's men struck, the Confederate defenders found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The battle unfolded in surreal conditions. As Union troops climbed higher, they entered the cloud layer that enveloped the mountain. Visibility dropped to near zero in places. Men fired at muzzle flashes and moved forward by sound and instinct. Units became intermingled, and command and control grew difficult for both sides. "I can see nothing but fog and the flash of the enemy's guns," reported a Confederate officer frantically to Stevenson. "They seem to be everywhere." Indeed, Hooker's forces were making steady progress. Geary's division had successfully turned the Confederate left flank, while other units pressed frontally. By early afternoon, the Union troops had reached the vicinity of the Craven House, a farm dwelling about halfway up the mountain that served as a Confederate strongpoint. Here, the fighting intensified. Confederate reinforcements rushed up from the eastern slope to stem the Union advance. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in places, the struggle made all the more confused by the swirling mist. Men fought with bayonets and rifle butts when ammunition ran low. From Orchard Knob, Grant and Thomas strained to see what was happening on the fog-shrouded mountain. Occasionally, breaks in the clouds would reveal glimpses of battle flags and the movement of troops, but much of the fighting remained hidden from view. By late afternoon, Hooker's forces had secured most of the western face of Lookout Mountain and were poised to strike for the summit the next day. As darkness fell, an unusual phenomenon occurred. The mist cleared from the lower portion of the mountain, while the upper reaches remained cloud-covered. Observers in Chattanooga could see the campfires of both armies twinkling on the mountainside, marking the battle lines. That night, recognizing that his position was untenable, Bragg ordered the evacuation of Lookout Mountain. Confederate troops slipped away in the darkness, moving to reinforce the main line on Missionary Ridge. When dawn broke on November 25th, Union troops reached the summit unopposed and raised the Stars and Stripes, visible for miles across the Tennessee Valley. What had begun as a demonstration had become a significant victory. The battle above the clouds, as it would be romantically dubbed by northern newspapers, had secured the Union left flank and dealt a serious blow to Confederate morale. But the decisive moment of the battle was yet to come. A frontal assault against the supposedly impregnable Missionary Ridge that would test the resurgent courage of the Army of the Cumberland. As Hooker's men were scaling the misty slopes of Lookout Mountain on November 24th, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman was positioning his forces for what was intended to be the main attack of the battle. Grant's plan called for Sherman to cross the Tennessee River, seize the northern end of Missionary Ridge at Tunnel Hill, and drive south along the ridge, rolling up Bragg's right flank. Sherman had crossed most of his troops over the river under cover of darkness on the 23rd and before dawn on the 24th. By mid-morning, he had established a foothold on the northern extremity of Missionary Ridge. Initial reports were optimistic. Sherman believed he had secured Tunnel Hill itself and sent word to Grant that his position was favorable for the next day's attack. But Sherman had made a critical error. In the rugged, wooded terrain, he had actually occupied a detached hill north of his objective. Between his position and the true Tunnel Hill lay a deep, heavily wooded ravine that would prove to be a formidable obstacle. The Chicago Tribune later reported, Sherman's mistake proved costly. The terrain before him was far more challenging than any map had indicated, and the Confederate forces were positioned with greater strength than intelligence had suggested. At first light on November 25th, Sherman launched his attack. His troops moved forward confidently, only to discover the unexpected ravine. As they struggled through the difficult terrain, they came under devastating fire from Confederate forces commanded by Major General Patrick Cleburne, one of the Confederacy's most skilled defensive generals. Cleburne, an Irish immigrant known as the Stonewall of the West, had positioned his men brilliantly. Artillery batteries placed on commanding heights swept the approaches with canister and shell, while infantry delivered disciplined volleys from behind substantial breastworks. Every Union advance was met with withering fire, and then repulsed. Cyprus has intervened. Mid-morning, Sherman's attack had stalled. He ordered in his reserves, sending brigade after brigade into the maelstrom. The fighting grew desperate, with units suffering appalling casualties as they attempted to cross the ravine and climb the steep slopes beyond. Colonel John Loomis, commanding a brigade in the assault, reported back, "General, we might as well attempt to take hell itself as that position with our present force." From his vantage point on Orchard Knob, Grant watched with growing concern. Sherman's attack, which he had counted on to be the decisive blow, was making no progress. Worse, Bragg was visibly shifting reinforcements from his center to strengthen Cleburne's defense. By early afternoon, it was clear that Sherman's attack had failed. Despite committing nearly all his available forces, he could not overcome the combination of terrain and Cleburne's masterful defense. The northern end of Missionary Ridge remained firmly in Confederate hands. This setback forced Grant to reconsider his battle plan. Hooker, after taking Lookout Mountain, was supposed to cross Chattanooga Valley and strike the southern end of Missionary Ridge, but his advance was delayed by burned bridges over Chattanooga Creek. The center, held by Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, was originally intended to play a supporting role, but now Grant turned to Thomas as his last option. "Thomas," Grant said, "can you take the rifle pits at the base of the ridge?" Thomas, the methodical, dependable Rock of Chickamauga, responded with his characteristic calm. "We will try, sir." The order went out. Thomas's men were to advance and take the Confederate rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge, then stop and await further orders. It was intended merely to relieve pressure on Sherman by forcing Bragg to pull troops back from his right flank. Neither Grant nor Thomas could have anticipated what would happen next. As the troops of the Army of the Cumberland prepared to advance, they looked up at the formidable heights of Missionary Ridge, where Confederate battle flags fluttered and artillery pieces were clearly visible. Many wondered if this would be their last charge, yet there was a grim determination in their ranks, a chance to redeem themselves after Chickamauga, to prove their worth to Grant and the other Union armies present. At precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, signal guns fired from Orchard Knob, and 20,000 men in blue stepped forward from their positions. The decisive moment of the Battle of Chattanooga was at hand. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as the Army of the Cumberland began its advance. 4 divisions, nearly 20,000 men moved forward in perfect alignment, a magnificent sight that impressed even the most battle-hardened observers. Their objective seemed modest: capture the line of rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge, then halt and await further orders. Confederate skirmishers fired a few volleys before falling back. The main Confederate line, in trenches along the base of the ridge, opened fire as the Union troops came into range. Men fell, but the blue line continued forward, gathering momentum. "They moved with such order that it seemed like a parade," wrote a Confederate officer witnessing the advance. "We could scarcely believe they intended a serious attack." But the attack was deadly serious. Within minutes, the Union forces reached the Confederate rifle pits at the base of the ridge. The defenders, mostly from General William Bates' division, fired a ragged volley before many broke and ran up the slope toward their second line of defense. The Union troops had accomplished their objective, but now found themselves in a precarious position. The captured rifle pits offered little protection, as they were designed to defend against attacks from the opposite direction. Worse, they were now subjected to plunging fire from Confederate positions higher up the ridge. According to historical accounts published in the Army and Navy Journal, what happened next has few parallels in military history, an unauthorized assault that became one of the most spectacular victories of the Civil War. No order had been given to continue the attack beyond the rifle pits. Grant, Thomas, and Granger all expected the troops to halt and reorganize, but the men at the front faced a terrible choice: remain in the exposed position under devastating fire, retreat across open ground back to their starting point, or continue forward up the formidable slope. In multiple locations along the 4-division, front regimental officers and ordinary soldiers made the same decision almost simultaneously. They would go forward, "What regiment is going to be the first up the hill?" shouted Colonel Arthur MacArthur, father of the future General Douglas MacArthur, of the 24th Wisconsin, waving his hat on his sword. With a tremendous cheer, his men started up the slope. Similar scenes played out all along the line. The spontaneous advance caught everyone by surprise: the Confederate defenders, the Union High Command, and perhaps even the attacking soldiers themselves. "Who ordered those men up the ridge?" Grant demanded, turning to Thomas. "I don't know," Thomas replied calmly. "I did not." Grant looked at Granger, who also denied giving such an order. "Someone will suffer for this if it fails," Grant muttered, but he allowed the attack to continue, recognizing that recalling the troops now would be disastrous. The climb was arduous. Missionary Ridge rises over 700 feet above the valley floor, with slopes so steep in places that men had to use their hands to pull themselves upward. The Confederates had established 3 lines of defense: the rifle pits at the base, now captured, a second line halfway up, and the main line along the crest, bristling with artillery. As the Union soldiers labored upward, Confederate batteries opened fire. Canister shot tore through the advancing ranks while infantry poured down musket fire. Yet the Union advance continued, not as one coordinated movement, but as hundreds of small groups finding their way up ravines and draws that offered some shelter from the murderous fire. Confederate General Braxton Bragg watched in disbelief as the blue-clad soldiers neared his main line. He rode along the ridge, attempting to rally his troops, but in many sectors, Confederate morale was crumbling. Some units, seeing the determination of the Union advance and fearing being surrounded, began to withdraw without orders. "Here is the death of the Confederacy," cried Bragg in frustration as he witnessed the collapse begin. By 5 o'clock, just 90 minutes after the initial advance began, Union troops had reached the crest at multiple points along the ridge. Once the first breakthrough occurred, the entire Confederate line began to unravel. What had been a disciplined defense transformed into a rout, with Southern troops abandoning equipment and fleeing eastward. The impossible had happened. Missionary Ridge, considered all but impregnable, had fallen to a largely spontaneous attack. The Army of the Cumberland, maligned after Chickamauga, had redeemed itself in spectacular fashion. As darkness fell, Grant rode forward to the captured ridge. Looking at the steep slope his troops had climbed under fire, he remarked simply, "This is a victory that belongs to the troops. They took the matter into their own hands." The Confederate Army of Tennessee was in full retreat, saved from complete destruction only by the gathering darkness and the exhaustion of the Union troops. The siege of Chattanooga was broken, and the gateway to Georgia lay open. Dawn broke on November 26, 1863, revealing the magnitude of the Union victory. The once formidable Confederate positions on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge stood empty, Bragg's army in full retreat toward Ringgold, Georgia. Grant immediately ordered pursuit, with Hooker's forces leading the chase. At Ringgold Gap, a narrow mountain pass about 15 miles southeast of Chattanooga, Confederate General Patrick Cleburne executed a skillful rearguard action, buying time for the main body of Bragg's defeated army to escape. After several hours of fierce fighting, Grant called off the pursuit, recognizing that his troops were exhausted after 3 days of combat and that his supply lines were stretched thin. The Battle of Chattanooga was over. Union casualties numbered around 5,900 killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate losses approached 6,800, including over 4,000 captured. Beyond the human cost, the Confederacy had lost its best chance to reverse the strategic situation in the Western theater. The Richmond Examiner lamented, "The disaster at Missionary Ridge is the most crushing we have sustained since the beginning of the war. The public, who a week ago were hopeful, even exultant, now feel a profound depression, a bitter disappointment, a revulsion of feeling which cannot be described." In Washington, President Lincoln received the news of victory with profound relief. In a letter to Grant, he wrote, "Understanding that your lodgment at Chattanooga and Knoxville is now secure, I wish to tender you, and all under your command, my more than thanks, my profoundest gratitude for the skill, courage, and perseverance with which you and they, over so great difficulties, have effected that important object. God bless you all." The strategic consequences of the battle were immense. Chattanooga, with its crucial railroad connections, became a secure Union supply base and staging area for future operations. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, once a formidable fighting force, had been shattered both physically and psychologically. Bragg, his reputation irreparably damaged, submitted his resignation, which President Jefferson Davis reluctantly accepted. For the Union commanders, the battle brought varied fortunes. Grant's already considerable reputation was enhanced further, leading to his promotion to lieutenant general in command of all Union armies in March 1864. Sherman would succeed Grant as commander in the West, going on to lead the Atlanta campaign and the March to the Sea. Thomas, the steady Rock of Chickamauga, received less public acclaim than his more flamboyant colleagues, but earned the lasting devotion of the men of the Army of the Cumberland. The battle also produced lasting legends. The battle above the clouds on Lookout Mountain captured the public imagination, romanticized in paintings, poems, and songs. The spontaneous charge up Missionary Ridge entered military lore as an example of the initiative and courage of ordinary soldiers. For the men who fought there, Chattanooga left indelible memories. A soldier from an Ohio regiment later wrote, "I have seen many battles, but never one where the heroism of the men so overwhelmed the mistakes of their commanders. At Missionary Ridge, we accomplished the impossible because no one told us it could not be done." In the decades following the war, veterans from both sides would return to Chattanooga, retracing their steps up Lookout Mountain or Missionary Ridge, telling their stories to a new generation. In 1895, much of the battlefield was preserved as part of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, the first and largest of America's military parks. The strategic importance of the victory cannot be overstated. With Chattanooga secured, the Union had driven a wedge deep into the Confederate heartland. The gateway to Atlanta, and ultimately to victory in the Western Theater, lay open. Sherman would pass through that gateway in May 1864, beginning the campaign that would eventually lead to the capture of Atlanta and help secure Lincoln's re-election. Perhaps most significantly, Chattanooga demonstrated the growing professionalism and determination of the Union Army. After years of setbacks and missed opportunities, the Federal forces had executed a complex, multi-day battle plan with coordination between three armies. The spontaneous charge up Missionary Ridge showed that the common soldiers had developed both the tactical acumen to recognize an opportunity and the confidence to seize it. As winter settled over the Tennessee Valley in December 1863, the opposing armies went into winter quarters. But the strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted to the Union. The wheels of the great war machine were turning, and the path to Appomattox, though still long and bloody, had become clearer. The Battle of Chattanooga had helped ensure that the gateway to the Deep South would become a doorway through which Union armies would march to final victory.